Snow was already closing the mountain passes when a hardened rancher swore no woman could last a season at Iron Brush Ridge. But the woman who stepped off that wagon wasn't fragile, wasn't begging. She was Pearl Holloway, stubborn, sharp, and unwilling to leave. While neighbors mocked and storms tested them, she proved survival was more than muscle. It was discipline. Yet when the law turned against them, respect alone would not be enough. Would this unlikely pair endure the winter, or be torn apart by the very land they fought to tame? The wind coming off Iron Brush Ridge carried the taste of snow, sharp as iron filings on the tongue. Silas Brennan leaned against the split-rail fence, squinting at the wagon ruts that cut down toward the valley. He'd seen the back of more than a few brides vanish that way, their bonnets bobbing as they fled before winter clamped June. 7, by his count. 7 women who had promised to stay, each leaving quicker than the last. He spat into the dust and muttered to himself, "Ain't no one stays." The mountains behind him rose like dark teeth, already dusted white though it was only October. Nights bit colder by the day. A man could last up here if he knew how to mend fence wire in a snow squall, or butcher a hog with the wind freezing the blood before it hit the ground. But women? They all said they wanted a home. What they meant was a roof near town, neighbors close by, laughter spilling from saloons. Not this ridge, not this life. Silas turned toward the barn. He'd sharpen the axe, stack more wood, keep his hands busy. The ground was hardening fast, and a storm line was crawling across the peaks. No sense thinking about women who never had the steel to stay. That was when he heard the wheels. A wagon creaked up the trail, drawn by a pair of mules more stubborn-looking than handsome. The driver was a stocky woman wrapped in a plain wool coat, a knit cap pulled over hair gone tight in braids. Her skin was dark as oiled walnut, her eyes steady. No fluttering lashes, no timid smile. She climbed down before the wagon even stopped, landed solidly, and adjusted the strap of a duffel bag that looked heavy with tools. "Brennan?" she asked, her voice low, clipped. Silas nodded. "Pearl Holloway." She shoved her glove tighter, then looked past him to the yard. Her gaze moved from the woodpile to the sagging porch rail, from the barn door that hung crooked to the chimney stones blackened with soot. No complaint left her lips, no sigh of despair. Instead, she said, "Your hinge is cracked on that stove. You'll lose heat by December." Silas blinked. "You fix stoves?" "I fix what needs fixing. Where's your kindling kept?" That was the first moment in years he didn't know what to say. Every other woman had arrived with a quaver in her voice, a question about church socials or neighbors or how long it took to reach town. Pearl asked about kindling. She stood square, the duffel slipping a little on her shoulder, but she didn't ask him to take it. She didn't ask for anything at all. Silas cleared his throat. "Shed's round back. Axe is sharp enough." "Not sharp enough," she replied, already heading that way. He followed, not sure if he was irritated or impressed. She set down her bag, drew out a whetstone and a small sewing kit, of all things, then tested the axe blade like she was inspecting cloth. Her movements were efficient, practiced. Silas leaned against the wall and watched as she hunched over the steel, scraping slow and steady, sparks biting against the dark. "You plan on staying?" he asked finally. Pearl didn't look up. "I plan on working. Stayin' depends on whether the roof holds." The air hung quiet for a long beat, only the whetstone rasping. Silas felt something shift under his ribs. He wasn't sure if it was respect or just surprise. She hadn't asked about courtship, hadn't mentioned the contract beyond what it was, labor for survival. She just asked where the kindling was. Snowflakes began to drift from the gray sky, small and sharp, carried sideways on the wind. Pearl straightened, set the axe down, and brushed her gloves. "Storm will be here by nightfall," she said. "Best get that chimney checked." Silas opened his mouth, closed it again. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the only one who saw what the ridge demanded, and she didn't look like she was about to run. By dawn, the ridge lay hushed under a thin crust of ice, the kind that broke with a snap beneath a boot heel. Silas rose early, as he always did, but found Pearl already outside, sleeves rolled, smoke lifting from the cookstove chimney. The faint smell of cornbread drifted into the yard. He stood for a moment, bewildered. None of the others had lasted long enough to light a fire for him, let alone bake. When he stepped inside, she didn't look up. She was kneading dough with quick, practiced motions, her duffel spread open on the table. Needles glinted in their case. A strip of torn canvas lay half-mended. "You're up early," Silas said. "Work starts early," she replied. "Boots leaking at the seam. Needs patching before the cold sets in." He glanced down. His right boot did gape at the side, though he had gotten used to it. "Been that way near 2 years," he muttered. "Then it should have been fixed 2 years ago." She set the dough aside and reached for a strip of hide. "Sit. I'll mend it." Silas obeyed without argument, though it puzzled him. He wasn't used to someone giving orders in his own kitchen. Still, when she pushed the needle through the leather, steady and sure, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: relief. By midday, Pearl had repaired both boots, patched the barn canvas, and taken stock of the pantry. She counted beans, flour, and jerky, marking numbers with charcoal on the wall above the shelf. "This won't last if the winter runs long," she said. "We'll need more salt, and the chimney's weak. Smoke leaks near the joint. It'll choke us when the snow packs in." Silas frowned. "You got a way of making a man feel like he don't know his own place." Pearl paused, met his eyes. "Maybe you don't. Pride's not worth freezing over." The words stung, but he found no malice in her tone, just fact. And she was right. He'd ignored the flu for years. He muttered something about checking it before dusk. That afternoon, they loaded a sled with furs and dried apples and made the long haul to town. Clouds pressed low, bruised with the promise of snow. Ironbrush's main street buzzed with men finishing their last errands before the freeze. At the general store, Silas bartered for salt, oats, and a new stove hinge. Pearl lingered near the window, watching men hitch horses. "Silas Brennan," a voice drawled. Boone Carrick, broad-shouldered and smug, strode across the planks. His black hat was cocked at a proud angle. Boone had lost his wife 2 winters back and hadn't stopped reminding folks how women never stuck with Silas. He looked Pearl up and down, smirk tugging his mouth. "Didn't figure you'd send for another," Boone said. "Thought word had spread no woman stays up your way." Silas stiffened, but Pearl spoke before he could answer. "That's so? Funny. I'm still here." Boone let out a low chuckle. "For now, ridge'll wear you thin, same as the rest." Pearl's gaze didn't flicker. "The ridge don't scare me. Men who waste time mocking others do." The remark cut through the gathered chatter like a whip crack. Boone's grin faltered, but he tipped his hat with mock gallantry. "We'll see." He stalked off, muttering. Silas felt the burn of shame on his neck, but Pearl's calm steadied him. "He'll try again," he muttered. "Then let him," she said. "We've got chimneys to reinforce." They returned home with supplies lashed tight. By the time Silas set the new hinge, snow had begun falling, large, heavy flakes that stuck fast to the roof. Pearl stacked wood by the stove and spread the ledger of supplies across the table. 2 feet by morning," she said matter-of-factly. Silas stared out at the darkening sky. He knew storms on the ridge. She wasn't exaggerating. That night, as the wind rose, smoke curled clean through the repaired flue, heat steady at their backs. Silas watched Pearl stitch by lamplight, her face calm in the flicker. He'd expected tears, complaints, maybe a request for the wagon back down the trail. Instead, she spoke only of how many logs they'd need each week to last till March. The snow thickened against the window. Silas leaned back, studying the woman across from him. She wasn't running, not yet. And for the first time, he found himself wondering what might happen if she never did. The storm came down the ridge like a beast loosed from its chain. By midnight, the wind howled against the shutters, rattling them so hard Silas thought the nails might pull loose. Snow slapped sideways across the windows, and the sky stayed black as a coal pit. For 3 days, the blizzard did not let up. The world beyond their door vanished. No fences, no barn roof, no trail, just endless white screaming through the cracks. Silas had weathered storms alone before. He knew the drill: stack wood, ration jerky, keep the fire alive. But he had always believed the doing was his alone, that relying on someone else meant weakness. Pearl changed that in ways he couldn't ignore. The first night, when he tried to sit up through till dawn, she cut him off. "You'll drop dead before the snow quits," she said flatly. "We take shifts." "I don't need shifts," he growled, pulling his coat tighter. She stared at him, dark eyes steady. "Pride kills more men than wolves. You want me to find you stiff come morning?" He had no answer for that, so he gave in, stretched out on the cot while she fed the stove and patched the draft with folded sacks. He woke to her shaking him at dawn, her own face pale but firm. "Your turn." They fell into a rhythm. She boiled snow into water, stretched salt pork into thin stew, and scratched crude heat retention diagrams on the wall with charcoal. He chopped ice from the doorframe, braced loose boards, and checked the roof with lantern light between gusts. It surprised him how steady she stayed. No fretting, no despair. She measured the woodpile each morning, recalculated rations, and even found moments to sew torn mittens. He'd never seen anyone so unflinching. On the second day, while the wind shrieked outside, she set a strip of canvas across her lap and beckoned him closer. "You'll learn to stitch this seam," she said. He snorted. "I don't sew. You do tonight. Needles smaller than an axe, but it'll save you same as one." Grumbling, he sat, clumsy fingers pricking more than cloth. She corrected his grip, her voice calm. "Slow. Keep the thread taut, not strangled." By the time he finished the patch, his hands ached, but pride curled in him anyway. She nodded once. "Good enough. Next time, straighter." In return, he fetched his old Winchester, laid it across the table, and pushed it toward her. "You'll learn this," he said. Pearl raised a brow. "Never fired one. You'll fire one now. Storm clears, wolves come close." He showed her how to break it down, how to load careful. Her hands were quick, her questions sharp. By the end of the lesson, she held the rifle steady against her shoulder. "Not so different from a needle," she murmured. That night, with the storm battering the walls, they sat in silence, her darning socks, him oiling the rifle. No words of thanks passed, but both kept showing up, each in their own way. By the third day, the stew had thinned to near nothing, but she rationed it without complaint. He caught her dozing upright, head tipped against the wall, and for the first time he saw how tired she was. Still, when she woke, she only said, "Chimney's holding, we'll last." Something shifted in him then. He'd thought of her as temporary, like the others, but here she was, holding steady where 7 women before had broken. That evening, the wind eased, and the silence outside grew heavy. Silas opened the door to find the world buried, drifts up to the windows, the barn half swallowed. Pearl stood beside him, breath fogging in the brittle air. She said nothing, just studied the white expanse. Silas glanced at her, then back at the ridge. He realized the truth hit him harder than the storm. He wasn't alone anymore, and maybe he didn't want to be. When the storm finally broke, Ironbrush Ridge lay hushed and glittering. The snow piled so deep, it swallowed fence posts. For days, Silas and Pearl dug out paths, shoulders burning, backs wet with sweat despite the cold. Yet when spring's first thaw finally came, there was something new between them, an ease built on hard labor, not words. It was Pearl who suggested they ride down for the winter gathering at the chapel hall. "You need to show face," she said, measuring oats into sacks. "Otherwise, folks like Boone Carrick will keep saying, 'You can't hold your own.'" Silas grunted. He hadn't stepped foot inside that hall in years. "Ain't my kind of company." "Doesn't matter," Pearl said. "You want to trade pelts, buy seed, keep the law off your land? Then you sit with them, even if you'd rather not." He didn't like it, but he saddled the team. They loaded smoked meat, furs, and Pearl's stitched goods. The trail was muddy, spring sun sharp against the melt. The chapel hall smelled of pine tar and roasted pork. Long tables lined with townsfolk clattered with tin plates and gossip. Silas felt the weight of stares as soon as he walked in. Pearl, steady as always, carried herself with no apology. Her coat mended neat, boots patched clean. Boone was waiting, leaning near the stove with his hat tipped back. His grin spread wide as he spotted them. "Well, look here." Brennan finally tamed himself a housemaid, or is she stocked a trade along with those hides? The room went quiet. Forks paused midair. Silas's jaw tightened, but before he could move, Pearl set her basket down and looked Boone square in the eye. "I stitched these boots myself," she said evenly. She raised one foot to show the clean seam. "Patched this coat, too. Can skin a coyote faster than you can load that rifle on your hip. If that makes me livestock, then you're raising fleas." A few men chuckled under their breath. Boone's grin soured. He shifted, but the sharpness in Pearl's voice cut the air clean. Silas, for once, stayed silent. Pearl lowered her foot, gathered her basket, and walked to the trading table as if nothing had happened. Silas followed, shoulders squared. For the first time, he felt the eyes on him shift, not just pitying a man who couldn't keep a woman, but measuring him by the company he kept. The evening wore on with fiddle music and laughter, but Silas barely noticed. He kept glancing at Pearl as she bartered her sewn mittens and measured thread for neighbors. Folks leaned in close, listening to her advice on how to stretch wool or mend seams. She wasn't cowed. She wasn't running. On the ride home, silence stretched long between them. The moon cast silver on the thawing fields. Finally, Silas cleared his throat. Could have left me to answer Carrick. You don't need to answer every fool, Pearl said. Sometimes silence stings worse. He thought about that all the way up the ridge. That night, while Pearl laid out her sewing in the corner, Silas took an old shelf from the barn and hammered it into the wall near her bunk. It wasn't much, just a second place to hold books, needles, and whatever else she decided mattered. He didn't say why he built it. She didn't ask. But when she set her worn Bible and her father's compass on it before bed, Silas felt something in the room settle. For years, the ridge had been only his solitude, his burdens. Now, without ceremony, it had made space for two. And though he didn't put it to words, Silas knew the shelf meant more than lumber and nails. It meant she belonged, storm or no storm. The shelf Silas built for Pearl stayed bare for only a day. By the next morning, she had filled it with a small ledger, scraps of paper covered in neat columns, and the compass her father had left her. Silas noticed she wrote in it after supper, her head bent in lamplight. At first, he didn't ask. By the third evening, curiosity got the better of him. "What are you marking down?" he asked, leaning against the table. "Egg counts, goat births, how many logs we burn in a day." She tapped the page with her pencil. "If we know what goes in and what comes out, we'll know how to last through the lean spells." Silas scratched his jaw. He'd always carried numbers in his head, never on paper, but there was order in her notes, steadiness that appealed to him. "Mind if I add the cattle sales?" She slid the pencil across without a word. That was how the ledger room began. Not long after, Silas came in from the pasture with a hard set to his jaw. "Buyers are coming tomorrow," he said. "They'll want pelts, maybe hog meat. I'll handle it." Pearl looked up from the ledger. "Handle it? Or hide from it?" His eyes narrowed. "Ain't hiding. You send the goods down, let them talk to a neighbor. That's hiding." She folded her arms. "If you want this ridge to carry its weight, you face the men who buy from you." He bristled, but the truth of it sank deep. After a long silence, he asked, "You'll stand beside me then?" Pearl nodded once. "On one condition, equal say in the work." It was a bold ask, but something in her gaze held no hint of bluff. Silas thought of all the storms they had weathered already, and finally said, "All right, equal say." The next morning, they hauled pelts and jars of smoked meat into town together. Buyers sniffed around, expecting the same meager trade Silas had always brought, but Pearl laid out mittens she'd sewn, sturdy coats, and tidy bundles of gauze made from torn sheets. She spoke plain, laid her prices steady, and didn't blink when one man scoffed. "Then ride to the next ranch," she told him. "You'll find worse stitching there." By the time they left, orders had doubled. Back at the ridge, Pearl added the sales into the ledger, her pencil scratching fast. Silas stood behind her, watching. "Never seen numbers look so fine on paper," he admitted. That evening, the sky darkened sudden with a storm rolling in from the west. They had barely enough time to secure the barn before rain turned to sleet. In the midst of it, a cow went down, calving too soon. "Get the lantern," Silas barked. Pearl was already there, sleeves rolled, hands firm on the heifer's flank. Hours passed in mud and ice, both of them soaked through, their breath clouds in the freezing night. At last, the calf slid free, weak but alive. They dragged it under a tarp, shivering, laughter breaking through their exhaustion. "Thought she was a goner," Silas said, wiping muck from his brow. "Thought you were a goner," Pearl shot back, grinning through chattering teeth. When the heifer finally stood, shaky but breathing, Silas felt something loosen inside him. He looked at Pearl, mud streaked across her face, hair plastered down. He meant to thank her, but what came out was, "Partner?" Pearl's smile faded to something steadier. She didn't correct him. Back in the cabin, they peeled off wet coats and sat close by the stove, letting the heat sink in. Neither spoke of what had passed between them, not in words. But when Pearl wrote the calf's birth in the ledger, she left space beside it, as though expecting him to add his own hand. Silas did. That night, for the first time, he believed the ridge might carry more than his burdens alone. By summer, the ridge looked different. Where once the place sagged under silence, now the barn roof was patched, the ledger filled with neat columns, and the animals fattened under Pearl's sharp eye. Neighbors had started talking in town, not all kindly, but business was business. Buyers came steady now, drawn by the quality of goods Pearl pushed into the market. Silas should have been content, but contentment never held long on Iron Brush Ridge. Trouble came one afternoon in the form of Boone Carrick. He rode up bold, dust trailing, a folded paper gripped in his hand. "Brennan," he called, swinging off his horse. "Got business with you." Silas wiped sweat from his brow, pitchfork still in hand. Pearl stepped out of the shed, eyes narrowing as Boone waved the paper. "This here's a claim," Boone said, voice smug. "Says you forfeited title years back when your last wife lit out. Land's in dispute now. Figure I'll save the county some trouble and take it off your hands." Silas's grip on the pitchfork tightened. "That's a lie," Boone smirked. "Judge'll see it my way. Got witnesses to say you've been living improper. Folks don't cotton to a man shacking up with a colored woman he never married." The words hung sharp in the air. Pearl's jaw set, but she didn't flinch. "Paper looks forged from here," she said. Boone sneered. "You keep out of this." But Pearl didn't. She stepped forward, calm and steady. "You talk bold about law, then you'll be glad to stand before Judge Harwood." 2 days later, the deputy rode up with a warrant. Silas was arrested on suspicion of fraudulent title. The sight of him hauled off burned worse than the storm had. Yet Pearl didn't waste breath cursing. She hitched the mule, gathered her ledger, weather journals, and the original land patent, and rode hard for the judge's cabin 3 miles outside town. Judge Harwood was a lean man with eyes that missed nothing. Pearl laid out the papers on his desk one by one. Deeds signed years back, sales tallied in her hand, notes on weather that matched county records. "Mr. Brennan is no squatter," she said. "This land's worked, sold, and accounted for. Boone Carrick forged his claim." The judge studied her with long silence, then tapped the papers. "You're thorough, Mrs. Holloway. You teach?" "Not formally," Pearl answered. "You ought to. This county needs literacy more than it needs Carrick's noise." With that, he dismissed the case, ordered Boone's claim destroyed, and sent word to the deputy to release Silas. By dusk, Pearl rode back up the ridge, dust thick on her coat. Silas stood waiting by the barn, free but worn. "You went to Harwood?" he asked, disbelief rough in his voice. Pearl swung down from the mule. "I went where the truth counted." She handed him the patent. "Keep this where fools can't reach it." Silas looked at her, something shifting deep behind his eyes. For years he'd borne his burdens alone, mistrusting law, mistrusting neighbors, mistrusting himself. But she had faced the law head-on, armed with nothing but order and proof. "You saved the ridge," he said quietly. Pearl brushed dust from her skirt. "I saved the work. The ridge saves itself." That night, while Silas checked the fences, Pearl sat at the table, her ledger open. The judge's words lingered in her mind. Teach. She thought of the children in town, scratching letters in dirt, their parents too tired to guide them. She thought of how order, once written, could not be twisted so easy by men like Boone. When Silas came in, she closed the book, but he caught the look on her face. "What's turning in your mind?" "Harwood asked if I'd teach," she admitted. Silas nodded slowly. "Would you?" Pearl glanced at the ledger, then at him. "If it means fewer forged claims and more truth, yes." Silas leaned on the doorframe, studying her. Respect glinted where doubt used to live. The ridge had been tested and held, but both knew winter would come again, and with it, another storm neither could yet name. The ridge had settled after Boone's failed claim, but neither Silas nor Pearl fooled themselves into thinking peace lasted long up here. Summer rolled into autumn, crisp air sharpening by the day. Pearl kept her teaching offer quiet for now, though she rode down to Judge Harwood once a week to deliver supplies or check the schoolhouse roof. Each time, Silas watched her ride off with a tightness in his chest, knowing she belonged not just to the ridge, but to a larger fight. By late November, the storms returned. One morning, the wind rose so fast it felt like the sky itself was cracking open. Snow swallowed the yard by midday, piling against the barn doors, burying fence lines and drifts. Silas shoveled paths until his shoulders ached, but the work never ended. Every gust filled the trail back in. That night, as they stoked the stove, a sound cut through the storm, a thin, panicked bawl. Silas froze. Calf. Pearl pulled on her boots without a word. Together they shoved into the gale, snow up to their thighs. The barn roof groaned under weight, the doors half buried. The ball came again, weaker this time. "He's stuck under the shed," Silas shouted over the wind. Pearl pushed forward, her scarf crusted white. "Then we dig." They clawed through the drift, numb fingers ripping at frozen boards. At last, Silas yanked the calf free, small, shivering, legs stiff with cold. Its breath came ragged, steam vanishing into the night. "Won't last long out here," Pearl said. Silas gathered the calf against his chest, staggering toward the barn. Inside, the air was barely warmer, hay dust thick in the gloom. They cleared a corner, wrapped the calf in sacks, and huddled close. Their own body heat was all they had. Hours passed in silence, but for the storm battering the walls. Silas held the calf tight, Pearl's shoulder pressed against his. The weight of her calm steadied him, though his arms burned. "You don't give up easy," he muttered at last. Pearl's eyes flicked toward him. "Neither do you." When dawn finally broke, weak sunlight spilled into the barn. The storm had eased. The calf stirred, its breathing stronger. Silas let out a long breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. Pearl unwrapped her scarf and draped it over the calf. "He'll live now?" Silas studied her face, hair damp, cheeks raw from cold, but steady as ever. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out something he'd been carving in the evenings, a small comb of smooth pine, teeth cut fine. He set it in her palm without explanation. Her brow furrowed, then softened. "You made this? Didn't figure you'd want flowers." She held the comb like it was more than wood. After a moment, she reached into her coat, withdrew a small brass compass. Worn smooth from years of use. She pressed it into his hand. "My father's," she said simply. "Kept me on course more than once. Maybe it'll do the same for you." Silas stared at the needle trembling against north. Words caught in his throat. All he managed was a nod. That night, after hauling the calf back to its mother, they returned to the cabin. The stove roared, clothes hung to dry, the air thick with wood smoke. Instead of retreating to separate bunks, Pearl sat on the cot, exhaustion pulling her down. Silas hesitated, then lowered himself beside her. Neither spoke of it. No vows, no promises. Just two tired people sharing warmth after the longest night of winter so far. The storm had tested them, as all storms did. But what lingered wasn't just survival. It was the quiet certainty that neither of them was facing the ridge alone anymore. Spring broke late that year, as if winter clung to the ridge with its last dying grip. Snowmelt trickled into streams, turning the yard to mud, but green shoots pushed stubbornly through. Silas and Pearl rose each day with the sun, their work carrying a rhythm that needed no words. They built a new shed first, hammering boards until their palms blistered. Then they added a sewing room for Pearl, a corner of the house with wide windows and a sturdy table where her needles, patterns, and ledger could live in one place. Silas reinforced the pantry, doubling the shelves for jars and salt pork. Every nail driven felt less like labor for survival and more like laying roots. They didn't talk about marriage. They didn't need to. The shape of their days told the story. When Boone Carrick's herd was struck with disease in early summer, Pearl heard before Silas did. Word traveled through town like wildfire. Cattle staggering, milk cows dropping in the field. Boone, proud as ever, tried to keep it quiet, but sickness was plain to see. "We've vinegar enough to spare," Pearl said one evening, measuring her jars, "and clean cloth." Silas frowned. "After what he pulled with that forged claim, let him stew." Pearl's gaze was steady. "Neighbors survive by mercy, not spite. You'd want help if our herd went down." Silas didn't argue further. By morning, Pearl had packed vinegar and gauze into sacks, lashed them to the mule, and ridden down herself. She returned after dark, tired but calm. "They'll lose some, but not all," she said. Silas didn't ask if Boone had thanked her. He doubted it, but he knew the ridge owed Pearl for more than just her labor. She'd stitched trust into its soil, thread by thread. One Sunday, a seamstress passed through town on her way west, her wagon heavy with bolts of cloth. Pearl insisted they invite her to dinner. Silas grumbled at the idea of a stranger at his table, but he saw Pearl's point. If we're to sell more than hides and meat, we need allies who know stitches. So, they laid a roast on the table, and for the first time in years, laughter filled Silas's cabin. The seamstress marveled at Pearl's skill, promised to send word along her route. By the time she left, Pearl had trade arrangements penciled in the ledger. Neighbors who once whispered began stopping by, not out of pity, but seeking advice. Mrs. Wilkes wanted to know how Pearl managed to stretch oats without losing flavor. The Jenkins boy came asking if Silas could show him how to set fence posts firm against spring floods. Folks no longer looked at the ridge as a graveyard for runaways. They looked at it as a place that held. One evening, Silas returned from the field to find Pearl balanced on the roof, hammer in hand, mending shingles. He called up, "You planning to fall off that roof?" She grinned down, sweat glistening on her brow. "Not today. Hand me another nail." He laughed, deep, unguarded laughter that startled him. He hadn't realized how long it had been since such a sound left his throat. Inside, the cabin grew into something more than shelter. Books lined the shelves, herbs dried by the window. The compass Pearl had given Silas rested on the mantel beside the pine comb he'd carved for her. Small things, but together they made a home. That night, as the sun set in a wash of gold over the ridge, Silas sat by the fire, Pearl sewing in her lap, and realized he no longer measured his days by storms survived. He measured them by what they built together. The ridge had stopped being a place where women fled. It had become something rarer, a place no one wanted to leave. Autumn returned with its long shadows and chill winds, but Ironbrush Ridge felt nothing like the lonely place it had been a year before. Silas stood in the barn doorway one evening, watching Pearl chalk sun angles on a board she'd nailed to the wall. Her coat stretched tighter than it had the winter before, life stirring beneath her ribs, quiet but certain. "You ought to be resting," Silas said, trying for stern but sounding more like awe. Pearl glanced over, one hand steady on her growing belly. "Resting doesn't keep chickens fed." Silas shook his head. "You're a mule in human skin, and you wouldn't know what to do with me if I wasn't," she shot back with a faint smile. The truth of it settled warm in his chest. She had never once pretended fragility, and he had stopped expecting her to. That week, they rode down to the courthouse together. Silas signed the deed that registered the ridge officially under both their names. The clerk, puzzled, asked, "Holloway or Brennan?" "Both," Pearl said before Silas could answer. "It's our land, not his alone." Silas signed without protest, and for the first time he felt the weight of the ridge shift. Less burden, more bond. Back home, Pearl stitched a quilt of small squares she had pieced together from scraps. Faded shirts, canvas patches, bits of fabric neighbors had given her in trade. The pattern was plain, but in the center she embroidered a small star. She hung it by the cabin door, where it caught the light like a promise. Neighbors stopped by more often now. Children came with slates and chalk, learning letters at Pearl's table. Men sought Silas's advice on fence lines, grazing rotations, and mule harnessing. The ridge that had once been shunned grew into a place people trusted. One evening, Boone Carrick rode up, hat in hand. His cattle had never fully recovered, and the swagger he once carried had dulled. "Heard you're keeping accounts for half the valley now," he muttered, glancing at Pearl's ledger through the window. Pearl met his gaze evenly. "Numbers don't lie, Boone. You should try keeping some yourself." Boone's mouth tightened, but he tipped his hat and rode off without another word. Even his pride had bent to the fact that Ironbrush Ridge stood firmer than ever. That winter, Pearl's time drew near. Snow fell heavy again, but the cabin stayed warm, stocked with jars and wood stacked high. When the labor pains began, Silas was there, awkward, worried, but steady as he could be. He fetched water, held her hand, and prayed under his breath in a voice she almost didn't recognize. By dawn, the cries of a newborn filled the cabin, piercing and strong. Pearl held the child against her chest, tears streaking her face. Silas knelt beside her, calloused fingers trembling as he touched the baby's tiny fist. "She's strong," Pearl whispered. "Like her mother," Silas said, voice breaking. They named her Grace for the gift neither of them had expected, but both had been given. In the weeks that followed, the ridge took on a new sound, the soft wail of an infant, the laughter of neighbors bringing gifts, the creak of a rocking chair by the fire. Silas learned to read aloud from the paper, his rough voice carrying stories into the lamplight. Pearl kept the ledger still, but now, with one hand, the other cradling their child. There was no wedding ring, no proposal carved in ceremony. Their vow was written in rows of garlic planted side by side, in a roof that did not leak, in 2 chairs at the hearth with a quilt draped behind them. One evening, Silas stepped onto the porch, the compass she'd given him still tucked in his pocket. He watched Pearl inside, humming softly as she rocked Grace. The ridge spread before him, fields turning gold under the setting sun. For the first time, he felt no urge to measure what he'd lost, only what he had. No one had run. That was the love story. Not in grand words, but in staying, in building, in facing the storms without flinching. And on Iron Brush Ridge, that was vow enough. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps us keep telling the truth.